Alright, well, just the one package. Remember, the P in ASAP stands for P. I wonder if you could kind of be clever with this, because they're trying to say, ASAP stands for Prime, as in, like, you get Amazon Prime and it delivers instantly. But you could also say, since the P normally means possible, as soon as possible, that means Prime is possible. Haha. I don't know. Weird thought I just had right now. Sorry y'all had to get exposed to that. First up, we have Miracle Queen prefers circus. Mirage Queen prefers circus. Oh. A strange title. Not that we're bereft of anime with strange titles. I mean, we literally have an undead murder farce. I'm not sure if we've dealt with any. Well, maybe we could classify some of them as undead. Looking at the back first, I see Region A. I see Japanese with English subtitles only. And this feels like this is a movie. Yeah, I can see only a single disc. Unless it's a short series. Guess I'm not sure. Next up, The Life of Budori Gusuko. Which kind of reminds me of a movie. That's a little tenacious. Let's see. Let's get the legendary metal edge to get in there and cut the plastic. I don't know much about this movie or series. Unless I already did get this on DVD, but I'm not sure. If you could save others, but at great personal cost, what choice would you make? Well, that's a Region A. That's an English dub. Curious. Alright, those are pretty straightforward. And then we've got Parallel World Pharmacy. Which, let's see, what does this call? I see that says something there. That's the complete season, so that's a complete first season. If there's more, ooh, different underneath the slipcover. That's always nice. That plastic is very pleasant. That plastic's being a little annoying, but speaking of a little annoying, that's blue and white, kind of hard to see. I do see a regions A and B there. Probably somewhere there it says yeah, I can see it there. I can't see if it's clear on the camera. Audio, English. This works better. Okay, yeah, I think I've figured out how I'm going to be able to see some of this stuff better. Got our 2 discs. Yeah, unfortunately, the release has been small. Hopefully, it's more just a slow anime season, but, I'll keep updating. Here's this week's Anime Blu-ray Collection update. Alright, let's get through this list. Demon Slayer Swordsmith Village Arc, Season 3, Episode 11. I guess I call it Season 3. Maybe it's a Season 4. It really depends on what you think of the train arc, which is kind of more of a movie that was turned into a sort of half-series halfway through 2 seasons. Maybe you could call it that. I don't know. But this final episode was pretty good. I was a little worried about it being maybe a little slow and pointless, but overall, it brought the arc to a good close. Like I said, Demon Slayer as a series is kind of got this fine balancing point it's dealing with where it needs to make The demons feel dangerous. The senpais feel very competent, and yet our main character needs to kind of be interesting in the main scope of things. And so, like, there's a lot of things where it's like, is this show giving us a little, oh, that's an interesting thing he's doing, but then taking it from us? Or is it giving us enough where we can appreciate what's going on? And it's balancing a fine line of doing that and trying to make the demons still seem dangerous, but it's balancing that line. And I feel like this episode does a good job of making sure it's giving us what we need in order to continue enjoying the series in more ways than one, because I would also say this season has been more important than maybe the past couple, because I'd say overall it's done the most to move this series forward. So overall I felt like it was a very satisfying story arc. You know, with its slowdowns, and they're not bad slowdowns, it's mostly slowdowns in terms of us learning a bunch of characters' backstories, maybe ones we don't necessarily need, maybe the action just slightly drawn out in a way that's okay, I would say. But very satisfying. You know, definitely looking forward to the next arc, because, you know, if there's anything this arc did great, is it... I've said that the previous episodes, or the previous seasons, have had a problem of criminally underutilizing Nezuko, and this one, you know, did great things with her. I do like the characters they introduced. You know, some of them are just like, oh, well, you're kind of a bunghole, aren't you? But, you know, I think he was still executed actually very well, and not like a, fuck this guy, let's just leave him on the side of the road dead or something. I don't know. You know, nothing that grim. Like, some of the characters, you just hate them. But he was great. And overall, pretty good. Jobless Reincarnation, you know, rewatching with my friend. So, dubbed Season 1, Episodes 4 and 5. I'm not quite sure what I think of Eris's voice, which is interesting because I think there may be some remnant of how she's supposed to look like still in the brain there, but not necessarily bad. So maybe watching it dubbed after watching it subbed, even if that was long enough ago that I don't remember voices too well, maybe that's a thing. But I don't know. But what can I say other than the contents of these early episodes are moving faster than I remember them moving, which is fine. They're revisiting things. Some of them are things that I would say I remember fine enough, but, you know, I'm appreciating seeing some of this older stuff and redigesting them, especially in context of newer stuff. But don't know if I can talk much more about that. Otherwise, you know, fine stuff. And I guess since we bring up Jobless Reincarnation, may as well bring up the subtitle episode, you know, which I watched yesterday, Sunday. So I would definitely say it's a bad episode, but probably not for the reason a lot of people might say that, because normally you're talking about that you're reviewing the episode, but in this case I'm reviewing a actual technical problem with the episode, where the first minute and a half of it had some sort of stream encoding error that causes the player to keep crashing. So if you try to watch it and you keep seeing this problem, and that's still a problem right now, I guess you can just do what the rest of us did, and you can just keep hitting the refresh button and getting a couple of seconds further in. I mean, it's like 15 seconds at a time near the beginning, which is not too bad, because, you know, 100 or a minute and 30 divided by 15 seconds is going to be 6. So that may make you think, oh, I only have to refresh 6 times. But it does get a little bit worse as it gets around that 130 mark, and then you just get past that point and the episode becomes completely fine to watch. So if you keep hitting the refresh every time it crashes, you do make very slow progress around that part. But eventually you'll get past the speed bumps and the episode will play normally. If that problem is still a problem, that's, I think, how we all have to deal with it for now. Hopefully they re-uploaded a better encoded version that doesn't have those bugs. But I don't know. I had already watched it. Content-wise, It was a mix of an episode. Mostly because there were some things about it that were really neat, but some things about it that were just kind of show. It doesn't matter how much you make the music sound playful. I'm highly questioning some of Rudius's decisions here from a moral perspective. And overall, the reason I would say most of that stuff works out is mostly because of how the characters work out. It's interesting because you remember some of my complaints about the Great Cleric, about how it's like, it feels like there should be reasons this wouldn't work from an economic perspective. And in this episode, it felt like, maybe not an economic perspective, but just from a social perspective, why it seems like it wouldn't work. Like, I feel like we've been missing some important context that might have make more sense, but the amount of time that passes in the episode just kind of brings it to doubts. And again, Rudius is, and to a certain degree, I actually appreciate the fact that he did that stuff, because this is a point that came up in Eminence and Shadow, but Sid's actions not necessarily being the right thing kind of makes it hard for him to be a self-insert. He becomes a character doing his own thing, and we can only sit there and gawk at him. And I sort of feel like this is similar for Rudius. He's had questionable stuff before, maybe nothing I would say quite as bad as what's in this episode. I've felt him to be very justifiable in a lot of his previous shenanigans. I think you can call it that, because this episode is a little bit shenanigan-y, but I do believe it also has some story-related consequences to it. But, this one is kind of hard, but the way the characters kind of act at the end of it, I don't know. In your mind, you can kind of sort of say, oh, okay, I guess I'll have to just accept that as it is. But, well, okay, it's going to be really hard to rewatch the episode, because I have to, if I get stuck in the first minute and a half, then I can't jump later into the series to get away from that crap. But, putting that aside, part of it, yeah, maybe you've heard me talk before, and some of y'all probably knew or don't remember or whatever, but I've talked before about how for some shows, I just don't really like certain actions they do, because it's all about making the character suffer. And to me, it's just, it feels in bad faith, in bad, it just makes me go, I don't find it funny, I find it cringe, and the fact that you're pushing cringe so hard is hard. Did this episode do that? I don't think so. I think it actually tried to do a reverse thing, where even though the stuff could be considered cringe, to a certain degree, I feel like the characters got more out of it than you would think. And part of the reason for that, I think, is, I don't know if it's a genetic thing, a cultural thing. Again, part of the problem is I don't remember all of the details of the stuff. But another part of the problem is, I guess it doesn't really tell us, and sometimes that's really good, show don't tell, and they're showing us something that kind of suggests that the characters are kind of more okay with it than you would think should be. And it's really hard to tell if that's the show being pretentious. I don't think pretentious is the right word. I started blanking. I don't know. Maybe the show being a little out of touch. But with all that aside, it at least had some actual interesting action that did happen in it. And again, that one's interesting because that one could have been easily pretty bad, and I think part of the reasons they were able to pull it off, have it be very interesting and fun and stuff, is basically Rudius didn't attack those people. He goaded them into attacking him so that he could then, defensively take them down, which is still a kind of attack. I don't think you could get away in a legal court. Well, you might be able to. But it was pretty clear that even if he wasn't the one that started the fight, he was pushing for the fight to happen, but just trying to get the other person to start it, I guess. But the combat that did happen was still neat, and overall, I guess we'll just have to see what happens from there. Because it's a weird mix of an episode, but definitely a bad episode because of encoding problems in the first minute and a half. No doubt about that. It was very frustrating to even try to start watching it. But otherwise, if you haven't seen it, it's probably an episode that could easily push buttons if you're if you're not the kind of person that lets water under the bridge. So, fair warning, I guess. Helk, episode 6. Let's see, what all happened in there? I guess serious sort of stuff. I'm trying to think how many of the details I actually remember, but some of it is building up to important stuff. I guess we're gonna see what has to happen after that. But I'm a bit afraid that it is deliberately not having our titular main character engaged in certain important actions or stuff. And like it has excuses for that to continue to be that way. And like it could then go off and say, well, let's just forget about them because they're not here at this important thing. But it's like, yeah, the characters that are at the important thing are kind of cool, but they're also kind of half comical because they were introduced that way. And yeah, okay, seeing their cool side may be okay, but to me it kind of feels like a story wandering around from its main premise. Wandering away from it, I guess. So, hoping it comes back together. Let's see, Sacrificial Princess and the King of Beasts, episode 18. Yeah. It's hard for me to remember all the details of all the stuff that I've watched. But I do remember that I think I remember enough about the main story beats in episode 18 to have enjoyed it and curious where it's going to go from there because some interesting things happen in this episode, both from a story arc perspective but an overall series perspective, and I'm just curious to see where it goes. It's kind of an episode with whose ending left a lot of good potential. See, reborn as a vending machine, I now wander the dungeon, episode 7. Kind of entertainingly offbeat episode, I suppose. You know, a vending machine, as long as you don't really expect much from it from a storytelling perspective, it's fine. It's not, like, spectacular, but it's entertaining. I think episode 7 is a really good example of that, because it doesn't really feel like there's much story or direction to it. It's just things are happening, sort of. Let's see. Undead Murder Farce, episode 7. I think a fun pandemonium of events are going on in this episode, and we're seeing a little bit of what makes our main characters fun to watch. Maybe a little bit isn't quite enough. It could be small chunks of it, but it does feel like it is not quite there yet in terms of giving us optimal entertainment for the main characters for whom we fell in love with this show and want to watch it. Not that the other characters are bad, but again, you establish main characters and you kind of want to make sure they stay relevant and involved, and they kind of have, but not in a way that I would say outwardly feels like the story's pushing forward. More like the story's wandering forward, and they're doing some of their fun, cool stuff. I think it needs slightly more, which could come in the next episode. But, strange one. Let's see, The Great Cleric, episode 7, didn't air this week. The Most Heretical Last Boss Queen from Villainous to Savior, episode 7. I guess okay stuff. Not necessarily the best this show has to offer. Like, overall, the two things that this show has to offer that are really neat. One of those is, our main character's OP stats, when those come up, those are really neat. And the other one is, when things happen relevant. Well, okay, I guess that's 3 things. Because one of those is, once certain key moments happen, they have some very dark commentary to say. It's like, oh, wow. I kind of like it when they actually say that sort of thing to other people. Even though it's very rarely done, it's something that gives the series a very different feel from a lot of other series kind of like this. And then the third one was, when the fundamental underlying premise, oh, they played this as a video game, they remember certain video game events when those come up. And this episode at least had a little bit of that third one, which is, I guess, why it was on my mind. But the other two other ones, I think, make it really special. So, looking forward to seeing what it does. Rurouni Kenshin, 2023, episode 7. Very entertaining episode. It's hard to say. It's really weird because while I don't remember the content of everything that's happening, I do still feel like I'm rewatching a show, but I don't feel like that comes from the show itself. I think it just comes from, I probably watched all of or a lot of the original series, even if I don't remember it too well. Unfortunately, you just start forgetting stuff. That's really quite unfortunate. And I don't know. Weird feeling, but still I thought it was a pretty fun episode. Reign of the Seven Spellblades, episode 7. I was also concerned about this episode. Not quite in the moral sense that the Jobless Reincarnation episode was. This one had me more worried about kind of the show dynamics. In a nutshell, one of the things about Reign of the Seven Spellblades that's been kind of nice is you have our character who I would call our main character. I say that mostly because the most important events tend to happen around him, and we tend to see things mostly through his perspective. But he's in a group of 6 people, and their balance in terms of personalities and everything is they feel like a group of friends. And so it's a kind of group of friends going through a magical school which has questionable things, and you kind of wonder about some of our characters' backstories and goals. And all of that's fine. What worried me about this episode is maybe some slight changes to that dynamic that makes me worried if it's thinking about leaning more towards the romantic harem comedy sort of thing. Well, maybe not necessarily comedy, but maybe just a harem show, where I don't think it's going to be outright harem, but you definitely have shows that fall in that category that, I don't know, they focus on a lot of other stuff and they have other good things. I think Black Summoner, which I rewatched last week, is a really good example where that's very clearly a harem show, and you just kind of accept that for what it is. This show doesn't feel like it's had that, and I don't think it'll have that, but I'm less confident that it's not going to go that way or something. So, that's my worry watching this episode, but beyond that, I suppose it set up some important stuff story-wise. Like, it would have been hard to tell if you just watched this episode what important things story-wise were involved. But after the previous episode, yeah, I think I'm getting what this show is aiming for and why it might be interesting and satisfying to watch the whole thing. But still have to continue watching. My unique skill makes me OP even at level 1. Episode 7. I guess stuff is sort of happening. I don't know. It feels like a sort of happening thing kind of anime, where it's like, okay, well, everything is a drop. So then what are these other things? Are those drops, or did people actually make those? Because this show seems to be a little bit back and forth on what gets made and what gets dropped. I guess you could say that... I was going to say only food gets dropped, but no. I mean, characters definitely gotten some non-food things. Now, maybe that's stuff unique only to him, but then it's also an inconsistency. Weird stuff, but fine. This one was a surprise, and maybe I shouldn't have been if I was paying attention to dates and stuff, but The Misfit of Demon King Academy, Season 2, Episode 7. Yeah, you remember that show that was airing like half a year ago or something like that? Well, Episode 7 came out. And it was a bit of a catch-up. Like, I could have rewatched the previous episode to say, okay, that's what they did, but, watching this episode, I'm like, yeah, that's what they were in the middle of doing, and that was some of the stuff, and okay. And it was an okay Episode 7. I don't know how okay it is in the grand scheme of things in terms of Season 2, because there's this great big half-a-year blank in my memory. I probably not remember enough about the first half to spoil it like crazy, but yeah, stuff. Am I actually the strongest? Episode 6. What did I think of this episode? Okay, I guess. If there was anything about it that I would say, oh, yeah. It's, even though the previous episode kind of established that our main character may be having to interact with a different set of characters, which I think is kind of good and refreshing for one where you make an OP character who kind of approaches things from a very different perspective than you normally see characters, you know. You kind of want to see, okay, how do other characters react to this sort of stuff, and you don't always get that. And this show looked like it could be given it, but it's like, oh yeah, it's probably not there yet. We'll have to see what it means for it to eventually get there, I suppose. But beyond that, they introduced a new character, and there was a take on this character that's like, oh, actually, that's not something it's something I've seen sort of before, but in this show they kind of bring it front and center as the concept is actually kind of an amusing and interesting take on it given the premise. But beyond that, you know, it was okay. Classroom for Heroes, episode 7. It's a bit of a mix of an episode, I would say. So I've said that even though some of the pacing for the episodes have felt weird, the pacing for this one felt fine, but even though some of them felt weird, at least the general concept of the episodes could be something that you'd say, yeah, that's a very Classroom for Heroes sort of concept. Episode 7 didn't feel like that, but, so the concept didn't feel that, but the character interactions still they still feel very Classroom for Heroes. I'm not sure if some of the conflict that was being dealt with in there is something I care too much about. It's a little bit weird, but it's like, whatever. Anybody other than our main character is basically, you know, I guess our main character and a couple of other characters who are declared as being explicitly powerful in the show. Everybody else is kind of like, sometimes they're good, but it's pretty common for them to be not bad, not good, just kind of whelmed. Let's see, Zom 100 Bucket List of the Dead, episode 6 got delayed. Dark Gathering, episode 7. An entertaining enough episode. I think if there's anything about this episode that was good, is this would be the first episode that felt like if this show was a Monster of the Week episode, every episode would probably feel sort of like this one. Minus little bits at the beginning and the end. Except, you know, like I said, beginning is stuff that, you know, happened from before, so it's a continuing narrative building. And at the same time, it's like, okay, well, I guess maybe they're just going to become a Monster of the Week, but the end of the episode made you think, oh, they're introducing another dynamic. And I guess I have to see what that is before I know for certain what to think about it, but, you know, it's keeping itself fresh. Sweet Reincarnation, episode 9. Finally an episode in this show that has anything to do with fucking baking stuff. I mean, there was a little bit earlier, but this is the first time it's like, okay, yeah, he's a genius patisserie who reincarnated, and we haven't seen any of that. We've seen him do a lot of other really neat stuff, and it's been fun. It's just, you know, been fun stuff that seems to have nothing to do with the premise. And while there was some stuff set up in the previous episode that maybe leaned that way, this episode is the only one so far that I would say this feels like genius patissier reincarnating and wanting to create his land of sweets. You know, that nonsensical thing that doesn't make sense to me, but okay. A lot of kudos to the episode. And content-wise, it was mostly entertaining. I do worry about it, you know, leaning a little bit heavily on misunderstanding sort of stuff. It hasn't done anything yet, but it does seem like it's setting up the next episode to maybe be a bit more about stuff like that. We'll have to see. So I'm a bit worried about how it's set up the next episode. But again, we'll have to see. And then finally, Level 1 Demon Lord and One Room Hero, episode 8. I mentioned that the previous episode did not have a lot of our main 2 characters in there, and that it was setting up story-related stuff. And I'd say this episode is kind of proof of that. So, like, it gets back in touch with our main characters so that we can, kind of see things from their perspective and some of the back and forth. There's a little bit of that heartwarming feel that I think I mentioned the show has. Maybe I haven't described it as that, but it's one of those things where you're like, I actually kind of like these characters. They're like, a lot of them are set up to be like, oh, is it going to be that kind of character? But they keep doing things that are just like acting the way they stereotypically look to the degree, maybe to the minimum possible degree, but otherwise being the kind of characters that the show wants them to be in ways that are just kind of, again, wholesome, entertaining. Not like gut-bustingly funny, I would say, but definitely, I have to say, I just really appreciate all the characters in the show. It's somehow continuing to worm its way. I mean, obviously I've been talking well about it for a while now, but a lot of pieces of it have wormed their way into, I'm continuing to enjoy watching these characters. So, I know for a lot of these, I do have to start paying attention because we are getting into like the second half. Some of these, like Sweet Reincarnation, is far enough along that it's probably about time for it to start setting up whatever seasonal conflict they're planning to have. I mean, they might not set it up until the end of episode 11, if it's a 12-episode series. And maybe what happened in episode 9 is supposed to be a setup for a big, major thing. But if it is, then unfortunately it's one of the less exciting things I would say is there, possibly. Unless they go certain interesting directions with it, which I guess they dropped hints that it's possible. But, I don't know. I should probably be thinking about how some of these shows are starting to look as they're getting into the second half. Beyond that, I don't know that I have much worth talking about, because the only video game I've played is Dead by Daylight. And I'm mostly playing as Meg because I feel like sometimes my head and brain feel cloudy enough that I'm not even sure if I'm going to be making skill checks. Surprisingly, I still make the skill checks. But it's sort of like, you know what, if I'm just going to play bad, I'm going to play the character that everybody associates with playing bad. Except for the one or two times I'm like, okay, this time I need to play very selfish, so I'll play as the character that everyone associates with playing selfish. In that case, it's Nia. And most of that, I think, comes from some of Nia's abilities, but some of her perks, but at the same time, jokes about her secretly being the entity from the Dead by Daylight universe manifest in human form, which is funny. The animations, I don't know if they were the source of it, but their animations of it certainly make it very iconic and stick with your head. But, it basically means I haven't been playing as my main Sybil, and I've actually been playing a lot of Survivor, not as much Killer this past week, mostly because I needed to get a lot of Survivor stuff out of the way, which is fine. Sunday night was really interesting because it felt like there were some very, very, very new people on playing. And this shows up in two ways. One of those is in killers who don't quite have a good feeling for how to do the timing on lunge attacks. And the other would be when you're looking at the auras of survivors and you're like, I know you're afraid. You blew up the generator 20 seconds ago and you're worried about that trapper coming here and getting you, but that trapper hasn't come here to get you. He was too new to know how to follow sound alerts, sound notifications in the game. And that was horrible for that poor trapper because the map was Mother's Dwelling. So, for those of you who don't play Dead by Daylight and aren't aware, it's a huge fucking map. And while Trapper has things he can do on that map better than some other maps, it's a map with grass on it, so he can actually hide bear traps in grass. That's more than you can say for Eyrie of Crows. Poor Trapper. But the problem is, Trapper usually needs to get downs on people by walking up to them and hitting them with his machete. And he doesn't have any way to really shorten them other than maybe some tricks to kind of drive people towards loops that he's already trapped. Because if a survivor's paying attention and you set a trap in a loop, the survivor's just going to run away from the loop. And you're just going to lose more time. So, for all those reasons, Trapper tends to be an M1 killer. That means mouse button 1, the left click, the simple attack. It basically means that unless you get some really clever traps, Trapper's almost always going to be downing somebody like that. And usually, a high-skilled Trapper against high-skilled survivors is mostly using the traps to just shut down certain loops so that he can go into certain less safe loops and eventually, down survivors fast enough, in theory. So for a completely new person who still hasn't really learned how to get people to hooks, time lunges, and doesn't really know how to set up traps, especially since, just opening traps or just putting them next to generators are kind of they don't work, especially if you don't follow the sound notifications of a survivor popping your trap. Basically meant that he had a lot of places to walk. He didn't quite know how to walk, how to find people. The other 3 survivors were all very new people. Maybe the Fang had more experience than the Adam and the Rebecca, but the Adam and Rebecca were very scared almost all the time. I couldn't even get the Rebecca to stop to let me to heal her. I don't even think she had any perks in the end game when it showed everybody's perks. Adam, of course, was the first found because even though he was fairly new, I think he had more perks equipped than maybe anybody else. He still had Deliverance, and the Deliverance curse was almost upon him, but he was saved from it because, new Trapper who doesn't know how to get people to hooks. And the Fang, what can I say? Eventually, she was like the first or second person hooked. I think the first person hooked. Because when I saw the Adam finally making a run for her to unhook her, I'm like, yeah, you do it. You want to get your Deliverance. Go for it. But she disconnected on the hook and became a bot. And then at that point, there were 2 skilled players against an unskilled bot. So, sorry, 2 skilled players against an unskilled new killer player. So, yeah, I don't think they had fun. They tried to catch me one time in a chase where I very deliberately... Yeah, I'm pretty sure I deliberately took a hit so that the Trapper would come after me. And I did take them on a little bit of a chase. Not that the Mother's Dwelling is the best, per se, but for a Trapper who's just not used to the map, it was hard for him. He eventually reached a point where he almost got me, but I got to the other side of the pallet and he just kind of gave up. So it was sad. Good news for him, he stayed in the match so he could get his BP because, you just need to gain experience. You need to gain blood points. And I tried to look for him afterwards when it's like everybody else is getting out, that's fine. Just to let him hook me, get a kill, let him know that I'm still cheering for him to get better at the game. I recognize it was very hard for him. I just couldn't throw, especially since, 2 of the other survivors were so fresh that, they were too fresh. Oh well. Maybe I did have some video game stuff to talk about, but it's more like war stories. Hopefully you appreciate an old man yapping about stuff. I should just wrap things up. Y'all, have a nice week.